Warning, this podcast contains sensitive material some listeners may find offensive. Listener discretion is advised.
Whether you're hitting the road or kicking back in the cab, it's time to take a load off with Big Rig Banter. Powered by AllTruckJobs.com, your source for finding the trucking jobs drivers really want. Get ready to shift into gear and let the conversations roll.
Hello and welcome to Big Rig Banter, a show about all things commercial driving and transportation related. I'm your co-host, Connor Smith.
And I'm Troy Diffenderfer.
And today we're going to be covering a very sensitive topic. You probably heard our content warning in the beginning there, but today's topic is human trafficking and sex trafficking. And this is something that Troy and I have been digging into and researching for a bit of time now. And we actually had the pleasure of sitting down with someone from Truckers Against Trafficking. Her name's Beth Jacobs, and she gave us a lot of great information on the issue and her story. And we'll get to that a little later in the program. But I think we'd like to start things off today with just a basic overview of this issue and some recent news headlines. So Troy, why don't you take it away here? I know you have a story for us just to start things off. It's the recent incident in San Antonio. So why don't you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so this story, Connor, basically takes us down to a Walmart parking lot in San Antonio. There was essentially 40 people found in the back of a large truck. 10 of them were dead and 30 were injured, including some small children, which is always unfortunate. They were eventually found by a Walmart employee when one of them asked the employee for water, and authorities would later find them. And these people were basically in a hot box. It was about 110 degrees outside, just baking on this metal box that had no working refrigeration system. So they were essentially sitting in there, and surprisingly, the driver is claiming that he knew nothing about it, but currently he is being held and charged with a variety of charges, including transporting illegal immigrants and stuff like that. And he could face pretty much his life in prison or even death, depending on how that turns out. And I'm sure we will kind of keep you guys informed.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to kind of break into this a little bit more in depth, when we talk about things like human trafficking and human smuggling, there's a slight distinction there, actually. When you're smuggling, you're essentially committing a crime against a border, and so it's not that these people were necessarily held against their will, or they were being transported against their will. Many of these people actually wanted to come into the United States, and they paid the ultimate price for it, essentially. And it doesn't make it any less of a grave situation for those people. But, there are different nuances to the ways that this is playing out in the world. And so you have people being smuggled, paying smugglers to get them into another country, whereas in human trafficking, it can be more of an abduction situation and a sex slavery situation. And so our next story here is going to hit on the digital realm and how that actually plays a part in this whole operation and these crimes. And Troy, I know you have a bone to pick with this website. They're called Backpage, is that right?
Yeah, that's true. And I guess this kind of, and I'll call it a hatred for this website, started when I watched this documentary. It's called I Am Jane Doe. I'm sure you can find it online. It might still be on Netflix, but it's definitely a very interesting documentary. And it talks about how Backpage kind of promotes the sex trafficking industry and the sex trade industry.
So what is Backpage.com? What do they do?
I always describe it as a sleazy Craigslist, which essentially you can buy and sell things on there, but unfortunately with that comes very sleazy buy and trade markets, including sex. And many of these men and women will describe themselves as personal masseuses or just personal dates for the night, when in fact it is a cover-up for sex trafficking. And I actually stumbled across this article on the New York Times that's really interesting, where Google is actually blocking some bills that would really put a damper on Backpage.com and how they operate.
So wait, you said they're actually in support of a bill that's going to hinder Backpage's crimes and sex trafficking operations?
No,
Is that
that's
right?
that's the crazy thing. Google is actually opposing this bill that would really fight sex trafficking, which has many people up in arms. The answer has to do with Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which protects internet companies like Google from lawsuits, and it also protects Backpage. So it's really difficult to prosecute Backpage when they do uncover issues of sex trafficking. This law is kind of in place for them. And for some reason, Google seems to have a vague and really poorly grounded fear that closing this loophole will open up a flood of lawsuits towards them. Obviously, Google is this huge conglomerate, and they feel like closing this will be an invasion of privacy, and it'll kind of open this whole can of worms that they kind of are imagining. And people are really upset because it's hindering police and kind of higher authorities from cracking down on these sleazy websites like Backpage.com. So that's kind of the bone I have to pick with them, and that's why I really encourage you to watch the documentary I Am Jane Doe. It's a awesome look at some behind-the-scenes crime that's going on that many people might know about, similar to human trafficking and sex trafficking in the trucking industry.
Yeah, and so that's just that's crazy. Like, I feel as though I heard you wrong the first time, and yet it's true that Google is actually opposing this legislation. And what's interesting is that this is one of the rare pieces of bipartisan legislation that seems likely to become law. So, both sides of the aisle are on board with this type of thing. And while people are saying also that, to stop this act, it doesn't excuse Google from really condemning this and trying to seek an advantage or avoid potential lawsuits of their own, just to have sex trafficking persist in the form it does on Backpage.
Yeah, and I'm all for kind of the freedom of the internet and freedom of speech, but when it's something as despicable as this, as putting people's livelihoods in danger, I mean, there's thousands of people that sex trafficking affects every single day, and the fact that there's websites like this kind of helping it's infuriating, and I know it gets a lot of people fired up, and that's why I'm glad we're here to talk about it and kind of inform you listeners, and we really hope that you kind of take this information to heart for sure.
Absolutely. All right, and so our next story is an article I found on CNN.com called Eyes of the Highways, Raising a Trucker Army for the Trafficking Fight, and it talks about the story of Kevin Kimmel, who was just your run-of-the-mill trucker, and he was stopped at a truck stop at one point. And he noticed that there was an RV parked. Didn't look like a particularly family-oriented vehicle. It had blacked-out windows and everything. So he went up to it, knocked on the door, and was surprised to find a sex trafficking victim holed up in there. And so he immediately alerted the police. And so really this article is talking about how truckers like Kevin Kimmel are increasingly seen as operating on the front line in the fight against human trafficking, and the role that truckers can actually play in helping this cause. The crime itself, human trafficking, is described as a form of modern-day slavery, essentially, in which traffickers use force, fraud, or coercion to control victims for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex acts or labor services against his or her will. And, victims are often women and young children, but men and boys can also be trafficked. Potential incidences of trafficking have been reported in every state in America, according to NHTH hotline data, and the issue was recently described as an epidemic by President Trump. And so this article also discusses that the most at-risk individuals are usually without a strong social or family support network, although anyone can be targeted given the circumstance.
Yeah, and luckily there are many organizations out there sprouting up, and some major ones already established, like Truckers Against Trafficking, and we were able to sit down with Beth Jacobs, who is a field trainer for Truckers Against Trafficking. You'll hear us refer to it as TAT in the interview. But she actually has a very personal experience, and it was a very intense interview, wouldn't you say, Connor?
Absolutely it was, but I think it's a necessary interview that we have to bring to you guys to really help raise awareness and get a perspective on this issue.
Yeah, and just as a second warning, this interview does contain some explicit material that may make you feel uncomfortable, but we do believe this is a very educational interview and that you'll be able to learn a lot from it. So here's that interview.
All right, so we're here with Beth Jacobs from Truckers Against Trafficking, that's TAT, and today we're going to be talking a little bit about just the whole human trafficking issue with some insider knowledge here. Beth, thanks for coming on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. So to start here, just wondering, could you tell listeners about your professional background and how you got involved with TAT?
I went to school. I have a social work degree, and I worked with many people who were trafficked for a very long time. I've been training people. I was able to start one of the first John schools. That's what they called them, but they're offenders prostitution programs, which focused on the demand side. So that was a very good learning experience as well. Yeah. So I've just been working in this area. I've dedicated my life to this.
Awesome. So what exactly is TAT's main goal or mission statement?
Our mission statement is to educate, equip, empower, and mobilize members of the trucking industry to combat human trafficking. Because, the truckers are eyes and ears of the road, really. I mean, they can really help with this issue. We have three main goals. One is to saturate the trucking industry, or saturate the trucking and related industry with TAT materials. And we also want to partner with law enforcement and government agencies to facilitate investigation, to catch the traffickers, the pimps. And then we want to, we want the people who are working on this issue to work together and use their best efforts to stop this, because this, it's happening everywhere. It's happening in our world. It's like we're not looking at it. It's in broad daylight. I think when we deny that it's happening in our area, it's an open field for traffickers. So.
And I know, obviously, it's a sensitive topic, but we know you have a personal experience with the trafficking industry, and it'd be great if you could tell us as much of your story as you can.
Yes. I know. I wish I could tell you all of my story. I don't know how much time we have. So
we've got a lot of time.
Yeah, we have plenty of time, so feel free.
Okay. I tell my story because I get to educate people while I tell my story. I don't tell it just to say, oh, wow, this happened to her. I want people to understand how this happens.
Absolutely.
And it can happen to anyone. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I didn't sign up and say, hey, pick me, please. I want to be a prostitute. What a great career choice. Right. It didn't happen that way. I came from a rural area, and I came from a rural area, and my parents were my father had to go up on the iron range and to find work for our family, and so he was away from our family a lot. It was a 3-hour commute one way, so he would stay up there during the week and then come home on the weekends. Well, their marriage didn't withstand that, and so when he came back, he moved to Brooklyn Center, which is a suburb right outside of Minneapolis. And so, my parents kind of played favorites. My sister, she was the golden child, and she still is the golden child. And I was my dad's favorite, but he wasn't there. So it was really hard for me. So when he came back, I asked if I could go stay with my dad, and they said yes, that I could. I had to get a job, and I had to finish my GED. And I agreed to that. I said, yes, I will do that. So I went to stay with my dad, and he taught me how to use the bus system. to get around. So the way that they did it is, even though I lived in a suburb, every time I wanted to go somewhere, I had to take a bus downtown Minneapolis and then transfer. I don't know why they did it that way, but they did. So I was always at the same transfer bus stop. Well, right by the bus stop, there so happened to be a pool hall type bar. And one day there was a guy standing outside of the door, and he yelled, "Hey, baby, why don't you come on in and shoot a game of pool?" And I said, yeah, no, I can't get in there. I'm only 16. They're not going to let me in. He was like, "Oh, yeah, they'll let you in. This is my joint. They'll let you in." He was just acting like he went there so often they'd do anything for him. So I said, okay, why not? So I went in, and they did let me go in. I was shocked. And they served me a beer. And, I thought I was very grown up then. Here I am, only 16, and they're letting me into a bar downtown Minneapolis, and they let me drink. And I was surprised. But, I felt good about that. So I would actually, because I had to wait for the bus all the time, there was always like a 40-minute wait. So every time I went down there, well, not every time, but more often than not, I would go into this bar and shoot a game of pool while I was waiting for the bus. So one day I missed the bus. It was a weekend, and I didn't know the bus schedule changed. So I called my dad to come and get me. He came and got me, but, he scolded me all the way home. He's like, you have to be more responsible. I only have 2 days off a week. He was right. Mm-hmm. And I should have been more responsible. So I said, please, Dad, I promise I'll never do it again. I swear. I didn't want him to send me back to the little small town. And he said, okay. So he let me stay. Well, the very next day, I went in there to shoot a game of pool again, but I'm looking at my watch this time, right? Because I didn't want to miss the bus. Right. And so I go out there, like 10 minutes before the bus would come, and I did miss the bus. The bus schedule changed again on Sunday, and I wasn't responsible, and I didn't call the bus company and find that out. And I couldn't call my dad. I couldn't let him down. I just swore to God I would never do that again the day before. And I thought, wow, if I call him, he's going to send me back. And so I didn't, and I went into the pool hall to ask for a ride home. And that's kind of what changed my life forever. So I went in and I saw this guy. I had met these two guys, maybe a week before that. And, I got to know them a little bit, and it might have been 2 weeks. And they invited me to a barbecue. So I went to the barbecue, and they took me home from the barbecue. Everything was fine. So one of them guys was in the pool hall. So I asked him, I said, hey, could you give me a ride home? And he was like, well, I have Miko's car. Let me call him and see. It was Miko and Mo. Mo was the one that was in there. And I said, okay. So he acted like he called him, and he's like, yep. He said, you can just ride with me. He's at a party. I'm going to drop you at the party in the car, and then he'll take you home. Well, I kind of thought Miko was cute, so I thought he wanted, to ride with me to talk to me. Because when I went to that barbecue, he asked me a bunch of questions, and I just, I thought he liked me. Mm-hmm. And so, I asked him, how long will that take? Because I didn't want to get in big trouble. And he told me it would take a couple hours. And I said, okay. I figured, well, at least I'll get home. I'll get to see Miko and talk to him, And so I got in the car. And when I got in the car, he had a couple McDonald's cups. And he was like, well, we're going to a party. You want to have a drink? And I said, sure. So he handed me one of the McDonald's cups, and I took a drink out of it. And then, the next thing I remember, he was waking me up, and it was dark outside. And I got scared because there's no way it should have been dark outside yet, right?
Right.
And so in Minnesota at that time of year, it would have been, I had 4 more hours before it would have got dark. So I said, where are we? And he said, we were at a truck stop. And he was like, baby, do you know what I am? And I said, no. And he said, I'm a pimp. And I looked at him and I was like, oh, wow, that's great, you know? But I'm not that kind of girl. I mean, I laugh nervously because that's what I do when I get nervous and scared. And so I told him I wasn't that kind of girl. I tried to open the door and get out. He grabbed me by the hair, pulled me back in, and beat me. And he said, no, bitch, I didn't ask you. This is what it is. You belong to me now. You're going to sleep with this guy in this truck, and he's going to give us the money, and we're going to go to Chicago. And so, yeah. I mean, I got scared. He beat me up right there in the parking lot. There were other people there. You know, he put me in the truck. The truck driver raped me. I asked the guy to please help me. Of course, he didn't. And then when he took me out of the truck when he was done, gave me back to the trafficker, and he was telling the trafficker, he told me, I'm sorry, he told me that if I ever lost any more money for him, he would kill me and my father. And so, wow, I was really scared. He had a gun. I was 16. I couldn't run. Where was I going to run? And people kind of saw, I mean, it was dark out, but they saw him beating me, and nobody helped me. And I truly believe nobody helped me because they didn't know what to do. I really believe that with all my heart. And that's why I do what I do, because I want to tell them what to do. You know, I want to give them the resources, because I believe if somebody knew what to do, this might not have happened to me. You know?
Right.
And so that's how I got in. And I think it's important for people to know that. I asked for a ride home. You know, that's what I needed, just a ride home. And unfortunately, I got more than that. I mean, they didn't take me home. He took me to Chicago. And when we got to Chicago, he brought me to this hotel on Lincoln Avenue, and there was like, when you drove in, you had to drive right by the office, and there was a courtyard of a parking lot, if you know what I'm talking about. It was just like a big square. So you couldn't drive through the parking lot. You had to turn around and go back past the office. And just looking at things, you know, it was just crazy. I mean, it's what stereotypically you would think prostitution looked like. I mean, there were girls there dressed provocatively, you know, flashy cars. There were a bunch of guys who were pimps. I mean, it was crazy. I thought, how could this be? I mean, where are the police? Why wouldn't they, you know, shut this down? How is this possible?
Right.
But it was Chicago, so there's crooked police everywhere. Just like there's crooked people in every field. And when I think about it, you know, law enforcement, if they're crooked there, who would they gravitate towards? They would gravitate towards, you know, prostitution and drug dealers, because they can take money, you know?
Right.
Anyway, and that's probably why it was allowed to be there. So anyway, I mean, I can't tell you my whole story because you'd be here all day. You know, I stayed in that life for 6 years. You know, after you get beat down over and over and raped, I mean, they told me I wasn't any good anymore. And I believe that because, you know, I was brought up in a church, you know, and they focused so much, of course, on virginity. You know, it was so important that you didn't sleep with someone out of wedlock. And if you did, you know, you weren't any good. Nobody would want to. And they asked me questions, Miko and Mo. They were asking me about my religion at that barbecue, you know, now that I think back. So, you know, I thought they liked me. And here I was getting this false sense of trust from them. And really, they were just collecting information to figure out how to best traffic me. You know, because they knew they could tell me, you're no good now. Ain't nobody going to want you, you know. And I believe that. You know, they told me I was born to be a hoe. And, yeah, I just had no self-esteem left. And I didn't know where to go. And so, yeah, I tried to leave a couple times. one time I tried to leave. The last time I tried to leave, I couldn't do it anymore. So I wanted to go home. I mean, there's a big part of my story that I could tell you, but I just think it might take too long. So I just wanted to. I couldn't take it anymore. I earned the privilege to get outside. They kept me in that room for I don't really know how long. It seemed like a long time. And there was this girl that would come in and put makeup on my face to make me try to look cuter because they brought guys into me, you know. And at first I asked them all to help me, and I would just get beat up, you know, because they weren't going to help me. They came in there for what they wanted, you know. And I learned quickly I had to do what they said, otherwise I would get hurt. And so the girl, she was like, I think she kind of felt sorry for me because I was pretty hard-headed sometimes. And she was like, just do what they say. Act like you like it, and they're going to let you go outside. You know, and she told me what I had to do to choose another pimp because this pimp beat me up all the time. He probably would have killed me. Anyway, so eventually he did let me go outside, you know, and it was like, it wasn't just him. You know, it was him, and there were these young dudes that would ride around us on bikes, you know, to make sure we were doing the right thing. I mean, it was like a team of people. You know, they worked together.
Right.
And so, you know, I really felt like I had nowhere to go. I felt like he saw everything that I did. You know, he would sometimes, in the hotel that he put me in, that we had, there was a closet door that had like slat blinds, like shutters. You know what I'm talking about?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, you can kind of see through them.
Yeah.
And in that closet, there was like this fake wall. I mean, this hotel was perfect for what they were doing. So he would sometimes go in there and watch me. You know, he wanted to make sure I wasn't keeping any money or, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Anyway, that really scared me. So I thought he could see everything that I did, you know, always. I felt like he was always watching me. I didn't feel like I could escape or get away.
Mm-hmm.
It was crazy.
Wow.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing so much so far. It sounds like a very just intense, painful experience, and you know, it's great that you were able to, you know, finally get away and are doing so much more to, you know, bring awareness about this issue now. I'm sure your experience mirrors, you know, a lot of other women and people in this sort of thing going on. So,
yes.
So I'd just like to talk a little bit about how much. Why do you think people are still so ignorant of this issue? Do you think they choose to ignore it, or do you think there's been any change in like the last 20 years since your experience, at least?
Oh, yes, there's been a lot of change. I mean, it's always been here, but we didn't call it human trafficking.
Right.
I think trafficking and prostitution definitely go hand in hand. People think that they're two totally separate issues, and they're really not.
Mm-hmm.
You know, a lot of people who are prostituted are trafficked. In 2008, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services did a pilot project with Polaris, and there were a handful of agencies that worked with prostituted women. They wanted to know how many prostituted women were actually trafficking victims.
Mm-hmm.
So they sent us these interviews, and we had to, you know, we gave the interviews, filled out the paperwork, and we faxed it back to Washington, D.C. And they determined, you know, if that person was a trafficking victim or not. And I know the agency I worked for, we sent 120 interviews in. And out of the 120 interviews, 118 of them were deemed to be trafficking victims. Isn't that something?
That's crazy, yeah.
I mean, that's a huge percent. So I think we need to look at that. You know, it's not, a lot of people want to say, well, you know, half those people, they want to be out there. They chose it. That's not true. I think that statistic is way too high. I think more people are trafficked than not, to be honest.
Right, okay. And so is there any legislature that has gotten traction or anything like that that's going into law to help fight against this? I know you're very active when it comes to taking on the government to this
Yes.
on these issues. Anything you could talk about in regards to that?
Yes. There is a federal bill right now. I think each state needs to have vacating laws. And all that means is that a person that is a victim of trafficking has the ability to petition the court and say, hey, this is what happened to me.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it doesn't, I think some people think I'm asking for their records just to be dismissed. That's not true. I'm just asking that they get a court date because it follows you. In 2011, I was hired in the state of Arizona. I moved to Arizona. I was hired as a sex crimes investigator, and I was able to work for a month. They fingerprinted me because they said I needed a clearance card to work with people there. So a month after they fingerprinted me, my supervisor called me in the office. She was like, oh, my gosh, I have to let you go. She said, I don't know why. They didn't tell me why. They said it had something to do with your fingerprints. And I said, well, I'm pretty sure I know what it is, you know, and I told her when I was young, I was trafficked. Part of that was going to jail. And she told me what to do. She said, file an appeal. Once you get the clearance card, you know, call Human Resources and get the job back. And so I did it, and I won the appeal. I called Human Resources and said, okay, how do I get the job back? And they said, oh, no, we've decided not to rehire you. And I said, well, why is that? And they told me because I didn't disclose. And I said, well, yeah, it's a misdemeanor. It happened 30 years ago. I mean, It was when I was 17, really. And I just couldn't believe it. I said, well, I don't want to disclose. How long in the state of Arizona do I have to disclose, you know, this misdemeanor charge? I was told I had to disclose for 99 years after the date of the offense.
Wow.
Yeah, that's a life sentence. I was like, wait a minute, that's not right. And that's what had me start doing legislative work. So I was able to pass a law in Arizona, a vacating law, so victims can petition the court and tell the court what happened to them. There's a federal bill right now, which I think will be very helpful if it passes, because that, you know, each state can use that as like a skeleton to create vacating laws in their own state. We just need to be able to work a job like everybody else. That's all I wanted. I just wanted to work a job. You know, and I was being told I couldn't work a job. It's like, what? I went to school for social work. I mean, what job am I going to get that's not with people as a social worker?
Right.
You know,
Exactly.
It's like, yeah, so it's crazy. I mean, I've dedicated my life to this. I've given back. You know, I need to be forgiven. I need to be able to have my civil liberties and work a job and rent an apartment, you know, and it doesn't happen for us.
So tell us about some of the workshops you do and kind of some other ways you promote TAT besides pushing this legislature.
Well, I like to do workshops. We travel the country and we train law enforcement. We actually kind of tailor the workshops to what that particular area wants and needs. And it's amazing. I love my job because I can tell them, you know, what we're thinking as a victim. I can give them the victim's perspective or tell them, you know, why we might not answer. You know, they think we don't want help. That's not true. You know, I think the fear that is instilled in us blocks that a lot often.
Right.
And so I think it's really important for them to hear that. You know, in my life, I don't know if you'll understand this, but the prostitution part became irrelevant. I didn't look at that. That's what I had to do to get someone to love me. And I believed that. I just, you know, I disassociated. I didn't think about what I was doing. I just wanted someone to love me. And so, yeah, it's crazy. I really like to do it, though, because I think I give them perspective that they can't get from someone who is not a survivor.
Absolutely, yeah. And so what are some things that truckers and the commercial driving industry should look for maybe when they're on the road or at these truck stops? If there's anything you might suggest that they could do, anything they could take action on?
Oh, I mean, anything that doesn't look right, it probably isn't right.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, make the call. We have little wallet cards that have the National Human Trafficking Hotline number on it. It kind of tells you what to do if you see a victim. I mean, we don't tell you to go confront a trafficker.
Right.
We don't think that's a good idea. But, if you're at a truck stop, for example, it tells you who to call and what to do. We tell people to call the police, although, I'm often training the police.
Mm-hmm.
But we kind of talk about, what to do. We also give them a resource paper so that they have phone numbers that they can call. I think we think, law enforcement, they know what to do. But they often don't know what to do because it is so hidden in plain sight.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't know they don't have the resources to take somebody to a shelter all the time, for example. They can't provide housing, and, they often are the first point of contact with the victim.
Mm-hmm.
But we need to help them with the resources so they can really help them,
Right.
and make a change. Yeah.
So in addition to those resources you just mentioned, are there any others you'd like to point truckers or even victims to in order to take advantage of these other resources?
If it doesn't look right, call the National Human Trafficking Hotline,
Okay.
and they will, they have resources that they will give you no matter where you are, no matter what state you're in.
Right.
They're very helpful, actually. So that would be something that I would definitely tell them to do. I talk about the victim-centered approach because it's so important, because we have this basic mistrust towards law enforcement. Because the trafficker from day one has told us, don't trust these people, they're going to hurt you.
Mm-hmm.
All they're going to do is take you to jail. Well, I've been to jail lots and lots of times. I mean, so, what the trafficker says seems to be true. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think it's so important that they try to establish a good relationship with a victim. If they look thirsty, give them a bottle of water.
Mm-hmm.
Or, don't drill questions at them and treat them as if they're the criminal.
Right.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, well, thank you so much. Really appreciate you sharing your experience and doing what you've done so far just to bring awareness to this issue. It is seeming like it's something that, people want to try to ignore, but they really can't. It's this darker
Right.
underbelly of the trucking industry. So to bring awareness to it is definitely a positive step in the right direction, I think. But yeah, thank you, Beth, once again. It was a lot of great information there. I'm sure our listeners are going to really enjoy and hopefully have, the information they need to, step up and, make change in their own lives and others around them in the community. Any final thoughts you'd like to add?
Just that this can happen to anyone. It's like no one's detached from it. So we need to share the information with our young people because we got to give them both sides. Trust me, with the internet, the traffickers are coming into our homes, talking to our kids, saying, hey, meet me at the mall, I'm 14. And they're not 14. So, yes, be careful. Educate your young people because we need to keep them safe. And we need to let them know that the boogeyman is alive,
Mm-hmm.
This can happen to you. And I think with education, it prevents that and it puts the trafficker to a stop.
So thank you, Beth, for coming on again. There's a lot of great information.
Yes, thank you for having me.
All right, so again, a huge thank you to Beth Jacobs for coming on the show and giving us all that great information and just telling her story. I really hope that resonated with some of you guys out there, and will hopefully stir you to stay vigilant and help wherever you can if you're out on the road and you see someone in distress or in a situation you think might be suspicious. And speaking of which, there are a lot of great resources. We mentioned a few during that interview, but we just want to reiterate again, the National Human Trafficking Resource Center hotline is available 24/7. So if you want to report a tip, get help personally, just browse the resource library. Be sure to head on over to traffickingresourcecenter.org, or you can call 1-888-373-7888, and there's people to assist you there in English, Spanish, and over 200 languages, actually. You just got to, make your way through the channel there, but it's more than possible to receive help through that organization. Additionally, of course, Truckers Against Trafficking. You can go to that website. You'll find, again, more great resources, workshops, training materials, and statistics. Basically, all the raw information that you need to really start bringing awareness and raising this issue up into the light. Additionally, speaking of light, there's the Polaris Project as well. They're a nonprofit, non-governmental organization that works to combat and prevent modern-day slavery and human trafficking. They work directly with victims. They host tip and crisis hotlines and offer solutions to those victimized by human trafficking. So just another great resource to check out. And we'll have all of these resources listed below in the description. And so just feel free to use those at your will.
Yeah, thanks, Connor. And, we both know this episode was pretty intense and kind of a downer at some points. But there are a lot of things that are already being done or in the process of to make human trafficking less of an issue and to kind of combat this epidemic. And I just want to go over some kind of more of the positive takeaways from this, stuff that's going on, stuff that's really helping to fight, so we can kind of end this episode on a high note, don't you think?
As high as possible, yeah.
But yeah, so again, we talked about it in the interview, but legislature has been passed, and that's called the Human Trafficking Victims Act, that will provide resources for victims of human trafficking, and they'll make it easier to find jobs. Actually, that's one of the most difficult things for victims that get out of the human trafficking industry is finding a stable job. And
Beth was saying that too. She had to disclose that even though it was, decades earlier. So it does hang around, and it's definitely something that can be overlooked in terms of support for the victims.
For sure, and luckily pieces of legislature like this are really helping those victims so they can kind of restart their life and start fresh, which I think is awesome. And then obviously awareness is continuing to grow through these organizations like TAT and Polaris, so we hope we see more organizations like this, and they're constantly growing and increasing their outreach, which is an awesome thing to see. And we appreciate Beth and those who are engaged in the outreach program for really growing the brand and spreading this awareness. And we feel identifying the human trafficking situation has become easier. Obviously, it's no easy task, but with more information out there, the awareness is growing. I think people are starting to speak up, and there's many ways you can report it, whether it's through a text message or phone call or directly calling the authorities. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can kind of put your foot down and really help your fellow truckers.
And it's just about kind of understanding the issue for what it is. You might be timid to, report somebody because you're like, well, how do I know their situation or something like that? But just to consider that a lot of these victims are held against their will, I think is an important takeaway as well, because as Beth mentioned, she said kind of how people are like, oh, well, they chose this lifestyle, but so many of them haven't chosen that lifestyle and have just been forcefully coerced into that situation. So you might as well speak up before it's too late if you have the ability to do so, but at the same time use your good judgment and caution, because you are dealing in many cases with criminals and people who don't mind using violence to get what they want. So when you're making these calls or you're tipping the authorities off to something, just do so responsibly. And it's not recommended that you approach the victims or their captors. So just keep that in mind, and again, use your best judgment when dealing with these situations.
Yeah, and just to go off that, luckily law enforcement is continuing to get better at identifying these situations because it can be tough. Many victims don't really know how to reach out in a safe manner or are often too scared, but luckily part of what Beth does is go around to different police forces and kind of train them on what to look for and kind of how to reach out to these victims, which is awesome. I think staying informative and being able to identify the situation is the first and biggest step to kind of combating the issue. We both really think truckers can become heroes in this situation, wouldn't you say? And it only takes a text or a phone call to change someone's life for the better.
Absolutely. And so on that note, we're going to close the show out here. Join us next time. We're going to have a show all about self-driving vehicles and automated trucks and kind of get back on the same old road that we've been driving down this whole adventure on Big Rig Banter. But yeah, thanks for listening once again. I'm your co-host, Connor Smith.
And I'm Troy Diffenderfer.
And this has been Big Rig Banter.
Thanks for tuning in to another edition of Big Rig Banter. For your next job, check out AllTruckJobs.com, the premier online source for finding the best driver jobs in the country. Browse hundreds of positions by freight or driver type to get back on the road with confidence. Click subscribe to keep the conversations coming. Until next time on Big Rig Banter.